Aquinas is certainly, an extremely interesting person and obviously a very significant figure. I remember in the classes I took on Aquinas and stuff I've read about him, it talked about how, 50 years ago really, it was basically not possible to graduate from a university with an honors degree or any kind of degree at all and not know about Aquinas. Excuse me. But then today, things seem to have changed, and a lot of universities seem to have gotten away from Aquinas, and I think that's really a shame. Of course, in seminaries, Aquinas is a fundamental part of the formation, as he ought to be, because he really, of course, spelled out all the apologetics and really got at exactly, what the faith is, why things are the way they are, the philosophy, the theology, all that stuff. He really specified that. But I think, particularly, today, 2015, not just for a seminary, but for, a secular university or, wherever, Notre Dame, Georgetown, Harvard, any of these places, it's really important to study Aquinas, I think, because, he really was the first figure to have to, defend God and defend the church and theology in a somewhat pluralistic world. Right when he's coming on the scene and writing, it's the scholasticism starts flowering and starts really getting known. And he's really, then he has to kind of talk about how God fits in a world where now people know about and really have studied, Islam and Judaism and then Aristotle and Plato, of course, not that they ever went away, but, they start getting, renewed attention. And so to see how he navigates those areas, the Jewish version of theology, the Muslims, and pagans, of course, who can write about, the creation of the world and deities and all that, and never having, obviously, of course, heard of Christ many centuries before him, never been exposed to the Hebrew scriptures. How can he write the great apologetic text in a world that has all these areas? And it's certainly, the issue, certainly for the church, I would think, in the 21st century, how to defend God in a world that, of course, has all these competing faiths and all these things that are competing on the attentions of people. And, of course, now with secularism, right, it's such a big thing, how to defend God when all these other things are competing against him. So that's certainly one. Certainly a very significant area why someone should still read Aquinas and why go back to him so many centuries later. And I think another area certainly would be, his emphasis on virtue ethics, right, and how, you really try to find a middle ground somewhere between utilitarianism and, Kant's, do the right thing for the right reason, or just a duty-based ethics. Utilitarianism is kind of like, some people would not defend it at all and pretend and kind of dismiss it as something that's not really a morality at all. And then Kant's, the do the right thing for the right reason, the duty, it strikes a lot of people as somewhat old-fashioned. When I read about Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt growing up at Franklin Roosevelt, of course, growing up at the turn of the 20th century, talk about, the obligation to help the society and to do these things for the right reasons. It sounds very, very old-fashioned, right? And so a lot of people today aren't going to really buy into that. But if you look at Aquinas, he's really going to strike a middle ground between that with the virtue ethics and looking at how do I become a better person? How do I become a whole person, and not just exteriorly with my actions, but interiorly? How do I grow in a particular disposition to do whatever, to be a better person, to be more faithful, to not be greedy, to be attracted to justice, to do all those kind of things? How do I go about becoming the person that is more disposed to those things? And it's not some totally pragmatic thing, or it's not well, it's my duty to do this, but it's really getting at the complete person and the complete disposition of the person. And I really think that's consistent with modern science and what modern science has looked at and examined, and the brain, from genetics, from all these things. It's like your actions come a lot more from the totality of your person and who you are completely, and not just some actions that are somehow disconnected from who you are at the most basic level. And that's something Aquinas started looking at, quite a few centuries ago. And today, science is kind of getting to prove definitive evidence that really his version is really a lot more accurate than some others. Now, of course, he's going off of Aristotle on this, but Aquinas, of course, is the one who formulates it in the Christian version. I mean, I think that's clearly an essential question, right? I mean, I think, to go along with, how to kind of move forward in a pluralistic world for the church, the other question for the church, among many, of course, but, among the more significant ones, is how to really defend God, right? Certainly his idea of not only, ipsum esse, God being, total being, right? And he's not some god or some random being out there in the cosmos. Father Barron mentions, the Russian cosmonauts in the 50s and 60s. They would go up to space and circle the Earth and be like, oh, well, we didn't see God up here. He must not exist. Well, it's like, no, that's not what God is. And no one's who knows about God really is looking for God up there. You look for God, right, in the sense of, in the world, right, at daily interactions. You're not looking for this being that just kind of started everything and then is just kind of disembodied and is out there, right? And what I'm coming back to is, and one of the things I'm coming back to is, Aquinas' 5 ways, right? It's not ways of proving God, and it's not, 5 proofs, but I think, he used 5 ways, the Latin word, for a reason, because it's a way to get to God, right? And a way to understand, the workings of God in the world, and also, this idea of reductionistic philosophy of kind of dumbing God down to, oh, well, we can, God is this being, or God did this, or God did that. And I think one of the great things about Aquinas there is that, if you talk about God and you say, well, I understand God, well, that means you're not talking about God. You're talking about something else. You're talking about the perfect example of something that you see in the world, but that's not God, right? That's not what Aquinas is talking about with God, and that's not the accurate understanding of God. So I think, the question is, people who, when they say, well, I don't believe in God, or I don't believe in the Christian God, or I want to find God some other place, it's important really to get at what exactly they think of God. And you say, well, I don't believe, if someone says, well, I don't believe in God, well, then you say, okay, tell me about that. What exactly don't you believe in? What, when you talk about God, what does that come to mind for you? What does that generate for you? And I think this is another way, really, of getting of the relevance of Aquinas, to talk about, who and what God is, right? Get a firm understanding of what God is, and not just, this one philosopher thinks this one philosopher thinks this, and they're based on all kinds of different things. You really have to have a fundamental understanding of what God is, and not reduce him to something very worldly, but rather, appreciate that, as what Saint Anselm would say, right? That if, God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, right? And that's Aquinas would have taken that and expanded on that. Why are Aquinas' writings the great apologetic writings these days? Because, and have been for many centuries, of course, since they were written, is because he was just interested, and as you said, in letting Christ come out in his writings, right? He wanted to defend the faith, and he was less interested in taking credit for it. He was less interested in his name getting out than that he would be able to present in a logical, intelligent, forthright way what the faith is, and defend the faith against all these possible objections to it. So, I mean, as an example of a priest, certainly that's the goal, right? I mean that if you're going to be a priest of God and work for the people of God, then Aquinas would be the example, right? Of certainly a great genius theologically, but also someone who has a goal of here's what I want to write, and here's how I'm going to write it, and then it's going to speak for itself, right? The work, the words, what I've written, that's going to speak for itself. It's not going to come from any other source. People are not going to read the Summa Theologiae and really learn about Aquinas the person, right? You read the Summa to know tremendous amounts about the Catholic faith, right? You read his other works for the same reason. And I think what's coming to mind is, I think when you go back to why Aquinas wanted to become a priest in the first place, one of the stories people do know about him, of course, telling his family he wants to be a priest and then getting locked away in the tower for a year, and then, all this fighting and everything that went back and forth to get his family to agree to this. I think, someone like that who is going to, over the course of an entire year, when he's constantly pressured by his family on the outside to kind of reverse his decision to go into the priesthood, I think that's somebody that really has a very genuine vocation, and this is not about him. This is about the working of God in his life that brings him to that point, and then allows him to be of service to the Dominicans and ultimately to the church and to God. And one of the stories I read about him is towards the end of his life, the Dominicans wanted him to found a school, right? And they said, well, you go and establish this wherever you want, and you take whomever you want, and and you do it, right? We know you're the guy, and you go and do it. And he didn't want to put it in Rome. He didn't want to put it in a place where he would get a lot of attention. He goes and establishes it and gets the people, and they started running it, and then it goes. And I think that's just the example that he would have set, an example for priests to follow, right? You get instructions and you do them, and that's what there is to it. But again, and this relates to, I think, his idea of ethics, right? This virtue ethics, and it's not just an act of, everything is not just an act of the will, right? It comes from something deeper than that. If it's totally an act of the will, well, then it's that can change a lot, right? And if you're going deeper than that into who you really are, it becomes less an act of the will than an act of the total person, right? And to be able to write what he did, he wrote everything, right? And then get to the end of his life and say, his writings are, a bunch of straw, or they're not significant. Well, obviously that's not the case. But someone who really kind of owned his vocation, owned his sense of priesthood, I think is, what allows him to say stuff like that in humility, sincere humility, but also provides the example, really, I think, for people coming after him, who study him, and should study him not just for what he says in his writings, but what the writings say about him as a person.